I want to be careful about how I describe what happened, because the people who have asked me since, the ones with lanyards and recording equipment, and the careful, patient voices of people who believe you are confused but do not want to say so, they always want the dramatic version. They want me to say I felt something pull me toward it, that I had a dream, that the building whispered my name. They are disappointed when I tell them the truth, which is this. I was buffing the display case around Exhibit 14 because I had missed a smear on the lower left corner of the glass the week before, and Dr. Haynes had left a note about it, and the smear was still there, and I wanted it gone before he came in on Monday. That is the whole setup, a smear on glass. A woman with a cloth on a Friday evening in late October, in a vault gallery that had been sealed to the public for 11 years, because the ventilation system needed replacing, and the university kept deferring the capital expenditure. A narrow room with low lighting and 6 exhibits that had not been touched by a visitor since the year I was 23. A woman who had been employed by the university for 14 years and had been overlooked for the facility's supervisor position 3 times and had stopped expecting anything to change. My name is Marin Solis. I have told this story enough times now that I know which parts make people shift in their chairs and which parts make them write faster, and I have learned to deliver the whole of it in the same even tone because the moment my voice changes, the moment any feeling comes into it, the looks on their faces change too, and not in a way I find useful. So I will tell it the way I have learned to tell it, which is plainly and in order, and I will trust that the weight of what happened will carry itself without any help from my inflections. The Calvarath stele had been at the university for 63 years when I first saw it. It arrived in a shipping crate with inadequate documentation and sat in the basement of the old Natural Sciences building for 11 years before a junior cataloger named Hepworth noticed it during a storage audit and recognized that it was not, as the manifest described it, a section of decorative architectural column from a 19th century demolition. Hepworth wrote 4 pages of notes about the stone's composition, its dimensions. It stood 212 centimeters from base to top and was roughly hexagonal in cross-section, narrowing slightly as it rose, and about the inscription that covered its surface from approximately 30 centimeters above the base all the way to the top face. The inscription was the thing that made Hepworth write 4 pages instead of 1. The characters were not consistent with any known script family. They were not pictographic, not alphabetic in any recognizable tradition, not related to the cuneiform or the Proto-Sinaitic or anything in the reference texts Hepworth consulted. They were precise, almost mechanically precise, the lines of consistent depth and width as though cut by a tool that did not deviate, and they covered the stone in a spiral pattern, rising from the base in a slow helix that, if you stood back and unfocused your eyes, made the whole column look as though it were turning. The stone itself was dark, not black, not gray, not the color of anything easily named. It was the color of deep water in a place no light had ever reached, and its surface was polished to a finish that caught the gallery's overhead lights and gave them back slightly wrong, cooler than they should have been, with a faint bluish cast that made the room feel, depending on the angle, either very large or very close. The base was rough, as though the column had been broken from something larger, or perhaps it had simply grown that way. Hepworth noted cautiously that the base showed no tool marks consistent with quarrying. The stele had been in the vault gallery for 38 years by the time I started working for facilities. I had walked past it with a mop bucket many dozens of times. I had changed the overhead track lighting twice. I had noted, in the way that you note things that exist outside your professional concern, that the stone was very dark and very tall, and that the glyphs on its surface were very precisely cut. I had noted that the glass case around it was slightly different from the cases around the other exhibits, thicker, with a different seal around the base, and a faint discoloration along the inside of the glass, near the stone that the conservators had documented as an unknown residue and had never resolved. I had not thought much about it. It was an artifact. There were 6 artifacts in the vault gallery. My job was to keep the room clean and the climate controls functioning and the glass clear of smears. The smear on the lower left corner of case 14 was about the size of my hand. It was a contact smear, the kind left by fingers pressing flat against the glass, and it sat at a height that suggested a child, or a very short adult, or someone who had bent low to look at the base of the stele from outside. There had been no public access to the gallery in 11 years. The smear was not there at my last inspection, which meant it had been made in the past week, which meant someone had been in the room who should not have been, or someone in the approved access list had been careless. It was not my job to determine which. My job was to remove the smear. I had a chamois cloth and a spray bottle of the conservator-approved glass cleaner, and I had crouched down to the lower left corner of the case and was working the smear out in small circular motions. And this is where I need to be very careful about what I say next, because I know how it will be heard. I was not distracted. I was not tired, or no more tired than a person is at the end of a workday. I was not thinking about the stele. I was thinking about the smear, and about whether I needed to do the full outer surface of the case, or whether I could get away with just the area I was treating. And I was thinking, in the distant background way that you think about things you have decided not to think about the facility's supervisor position, and the fact that it had been reposted, and that I had been told by a colleague that the shortlist had already been determined informally, and that I was not on it. I moved the cloth to the very bottom edge of the smear, and the cloth slipped. It is a minor thing, a simple thing. The chamois pulled slightly under my fingers and my hand went forward, and the glass case was not, as I had assumed, fully sealed at the lower left corner. There was a gap, small, a few centimeters at most, a defect in the base seal that I had not noted and should have, and my hand went through the gap and my palm met the surface of the Calvarath stele. I felt the cold of it first. It was much colder than the ambient temperature of the room, which is maintained at 16 degrees Celsius for preservation. It was the cold of something that had been cold for a very long time, in a way that has nothing to do with air temperature. My palm registered it and sent the signal, and I started to pull my hand back. The stele warmed. Not gradually, not in the way a stone warms when held. Instantaneously and completely, from the cold of deep storage to the temperature of a living body, in the time it took me to register that I should remove my hand. And with the warmth came a vibration, not mechanical, not like the building's HVAC system or the freight elevator in the basement, but a frequency that moved through the stone and into my palm and up my arm and into my sternum. And I can tell you that the nearest thing I have ever felt to it was the low note of a very large pipe organ in a stone church. But that comparison is inadequate, and I know it is inadequate, and I use it only because I have no better language. I did not remove my hand. I want to be honest about that. I had already begun to pull back, and the warmth and the vibration came, and I stopped pulling. I am not certain why. It was not fear. It was not fascination exactly, or not only fascination. It was something more like the feeling of having said the right word in a sentence you have been struggling with for a long time. A kind of settling, a rightness, that made withdrawal seem like the wrong action rather than the safe one. I left my palm flat against the surface of the stone and stayed crouched in front of the lower left corner of the case, and I waited, and the stele did what it had apparently been waiting to do. The glyphs began to change. I say change because I lack a better word. The incised lines, the spiral inscription that covered the column from base to crown, began to illuminate. Not from any light source inside the stone, there was no light source. The stone itself became the source. The lines of the inscription filled with a pale, cold luminescence, white at the core and very faintly violet at the edges, the way a lightning channel leaves its image briefly on the air, and the illumination moved. It moved from my palm upward, spreading along the helix of the inscription in both directions simultaneously, down toward the base and up toward the crown, and it moved at a pace that I can only describe as deliberate, not the speed of electricity, not the speed of any physical process I can name, the pace of a statement being made, of something choosing its moment. The room changed with it. The ambient lighting from the overhead tracks was overwhelmed, not switched off, not replaced, just made irrelevant by the stone's output, which was greater and cleaner and lit the vault gallery with the quality of light that comes through tall windows in a stone building on a gray morning. The other 5 display cases in the room caught it on their glass surfaces and threw back their own faint reflections. And for a moment the vault gallery looked less like a basement room in a university building, and more like something it had perhaps always been, without knowing it, a chamber built for keeping. I was still crouched. My palm was still flat against the stone. I had not moved, and I had not called out, and I want to acknowledge that this was not courage. It was that I simply could not locate the reflex that would have told my body to do either of those things. Everything in me was attending to what was happening, and there was no spare capacity for alarm. The illumination reached the top face of the stele. The whole column was lit now, the full spiral inscription blazing with that cold, pale violet white, and then the stone was still for a moment, a deliberate pause, the pause of something that has completed a preparation, and then the top face opened. I do not mean cracked. I do not mean broke or fractured or eroded. I mean opened in the way that a sealed thing opens when it has decided to. A seam appeared across the top face that had not been there, and the material of the stone drew back along the seam with a sound that was barely sound, more a resonance in the lower range of hearing, felt in the chest rather than heard in the ears, and from the opening came a vertical beam of light, pale and very slightly cold-colored, that rose from the top of the stele straight up toward the low ceiling of the vault gallery and diffused there into a wash of cool illumination, and the whole room was now lit by the stone. And I was still crouched with my palm against it, and my arm had stopped shaking. I had not noticed my arm was shaking until it stopped. The voice, when it came from the stone and from the room simultaneously, in the way that a sound comes from a speaker that is also from every surface the sound has touched, and I will not pretend to you that I can describe it with precision. I can tell you the qualities of it. It was not human. It was not inhuman in the way that a synthesized voice is inhuman, not approximate, not constructed from parts. It was an older kind of not human, the kind that makes a human voice seem like a very specific and local instrument, narrowly adapted for a specific geography of air and tissue. The voice had depth and range, and something at its edge that was close to weariness, the weariness of something that has been patient for a very long time and has not found the waiting easy. It spoke once. It did not preface what it said with any form of greeting or identification. It said what it said, and then it was quiet. Voice of the first accord. 5 words, that was all. But I need to try to describe what happened to me in the second those 5 words were delivered, because the words alone, extracted from what accompanied them, give you nothing. They are just words, a title, a designation, something that could mean anything or nothing if you read it on a page. What accompanied them was a transfer of knowing. I do not call it knowledge, because knowledge is assembled and organized and comes to you in parts over time. What came to me in that second was not assembled. It arrived whole. The way you do not learn the grammar of your first language. You do not study it. You do not accumulate it. But one morning you are speaking and it is simply there, already inside you, already functioning. This was not language, but it arrived in the same way, with the same quality of always having been there. A framework that had been dormant inside me, inside my bones, inside whatever is carried forward from one generation to the next without names or documentation, unfurled. It was not information. It was comprehension. the kind that precedes information, the architecture that receives it and makes it legible. What I comprehended was this. There are civilizations that are older than the idea of civilization, older than the word, older than the human project of building and naming and classifying. Most of them never encountered each other, because the distances involved are not distances in the human sense. They are distances in the sense of categorical separation, of having developed their entire understanding of existence in complete isolation from any other perspective, so that even the concept of another perspective is something that has to be approached from outside your existing categories, which means you cannot approach it from inside them. Most of them never tried. The effort was too expensive, and the benefit too uncertain, and the architecture of their own comprehension too stable and too complete to make the reaching out feel necessary. But some did. Some civilizations reached the edge of their own categories and found that something else had reached its own edge and was standing there, and the encounter was not clean. It could not be. Two forms of intelligence that have developed in complete isolation are not merely different in language or custom or the specific content of their beliefs. They are different in the grammar of reality. The way a sentence is structured, where it places its emphasis, which elements it treats as subjects and which as objects, what it takes for granted about time and causation, and the continuity of things is not arbitrary. It reflects the deep architecture of a mind that has been built in a particular place under particular conditions. And when two architectures that are built in entirely different places under entirely different conditions meet, the catastrophe is not war, or not primarily war. The catastrophe is that there is no shared structure for the most basic propositions. Not language. Language is a technical problem, and technical problems are solvable. Something prior to language. The categories in which existence is understood. The grammar of what it means for anything to be real, to matter, to persist, to end. The question of whether there is, in any meaningful sense, a thing that persists at all, or whether the appearance of persistence is a local artifact of the architecture doing the perceiving. These two civilizations, I have no names for them. There are no names that would mean anything in any language I have access to, so I will call them the first and the second, which are designations so minimal they are almost nothing, which feels appropriate. These two civilizations were very old and very complete, and had collided across the categorical gulf and spent a long time trying to harm each other, and a long time discovering that harming each other was not, in the end, what either of them needed. What they needed was comprehension, not agreement, not resolution of their fundamental differences, not the abandonment of either framework. Just comprehension, the ability to know that something was being said and to know roughly what kind of thing it was, even without being able to share the categories that gave it its full meaning. The first accord was an attempt to build the structure in which that minimal comprehension could occur. Not a translation system. Translation requires shared categories, and these two had none. Something more fundamental, a bridge, a space in which meaning from the first civilization and meaning from the second civilization could generate overlap, could touch at a point that was inside neither framework but was accessible from both. The bridge required a medium. The medium could not be from either civilization, because a medium from either side would be built from one framework and could not genuinely access the other without ceasing to be what it was. The medium had to be something that was prior to both, that had not yet fully committed to a categorical architecture, that was still in the early stages of developing its own framework, and was therefore capable of remaining genuinely open to both without being owned by either. A bridge species, not because of its power, it had none compared to either of the old civilizations, not because of its intelligence, which was real but was not the relevant variable, because of its neutrality, because of the particular frequency that a mind generates when it is genuinely in process of becoming, when it has not yet consolidated its categories so fully that it can no longer experience genuine novelty. The frequency of a species that is still capable of being surprised by the nature of existence. still capable of comprehending a thing it has no prior category for. Still capable, in other words, of the only cognitive act the accord required, genuine apprehension across the categorical gulf. Humanity. I want to sit with that word for a moment, the way I had to sit with it that night in the vault gallery. Humanity. Not the species of its achievements, not the species of its wars, not the species of its monuments and its atrocities and its long-accumulated argument with itself about what it is and what it is for. Humanity as a tuning fork. Humanity as the right material for an instrument that needed a specific resonance. The choice was not a compliment, and it was not an insult. It was a technical judgment made by something very old about the acoustic properties of something very young. The instrument had been designed for a material that was still acoustically alive, and we were that material not despite our incompleteness, but because of it. Our half-formed categories, our persistent openness to being wrong about the nature of things, our long history of standing at the edge of what we understood and not being destroyed by the view. The stele was not a record, or not only a record, it was a receiving station. It had been placed here, by which I mean placed on this planet, in this location, in this form, as a listening post and a trigger mechanism. It was waiting for a carrier. It had been waiting for a carrier for a long time. It had done what these things do when they wait. It sat in stone and was cold and did not move, and was filed incorrectly in shipping manifests, and sat in university basements for 11 years, and was moved to vault galleries, whose ventilation was never upgraded, and was examined by junior catalogers who wrote careful notes about its unknown script, and then retired without answers. It waited in the way that only very old things can wait, which is without any experience of duration whatsoever. For the stele, it had not been a long time. For the stele, the wait had no length. There was the state before the carrier arrived, and there was the state after, and in between there was nothing that could be called waiting in any sense that implies suffering. This I understood in that second. This and its corollary, that I had been the carrier all along. Not specifically me, not Marin Solly's maintenance technician, 14 years employed, overlooked for supervisor 3 times, standing at the wrong edge of her life with a chamois cloth in her hand. Not this specific instantiation, but the lineage that runs through me, the long line of unremarkable people from whom I descend, each of them carrying in their biology the particular frequency that the stele was calibrated to receive. My grandmother, who cleaned floors in a municipal building for 40 years and was remembered by almost nobody. Her mother, who carried water and did not leave a name behind. Back and back and back, through the long chain of people who did the necessary, unseen work of the world and were passed over and endured it and kept working, each of them carrying it, none of them knowing. The stele had not been waiting for a remarkable person. It had been waiting for the person who carried the right frequency. And the right frequency, it turned out, had been preserved most reliably in the people who had never been given a reason to change it. The people who had stayed close to what they were, not because they lacked ambition, but because the world had consistently declined to make room for their ambition, and so they had kept their original shape. I have said this to the people with lanyards, and they write it down very carefully, and then they look at each other, and I can see them deciding whether this is a psychological rationalization of my professional situation, or whether it is the literal truth of a cosmic process. I do not help them decide. It is both. The cosmos, I have come to understand, does not particularly separate those two categories. I stayed crouched in front of the stele for a long time. I am not certain how long. The light from the stone did not diminish while I was in contact with it, and I kept my palm against the surface, and I did not weep and I did not exult, and I did not say anything aloud. I sat with the weight of what I had just been given, and I tried to take its measure, and the honest answer is that I could not. You can be handed a framework for comprehending the most enormous things and still be a person who has spent the day worrying about a smear on glass. The enormity does not immediately dissolve the ordinary concerns. They sit alongside each other, the enormous and the ordinary, and you have to find a way to hold both at once, and it takes time. At some point, I became aware of the silence in the building. The Friday evening silence of a large institution that has emptied out, in which the climate control systems and the building's mechanical infrastructure are the only sounds, regular and indifferent. I became aware that the vault gallery was still lit by the steel, and that I was still crouched against it, and that my knees ached and my back ached and I was thirsty. These things came back to me gradually, the small physical inventory of a body that had been somewhere else for a while and was now returning. I withdrew my palm slowly. The warmth faded when I broke contact, not suddenly but over a few seconds, the stone cooling toward its storage temperature again. The illumination did not extinguish, it dimmed, to roughly the level of a thick nightlight, so that the spiral inscription remained softly lit with that pale violet white, just visible, just enough to see. The beam from the top face narrowed and receded. The seam in the top face closed again, soundlessly, the material flowing back to seamless solidity as though it had always been whole. I sat back on my heels and looked at the steel for a while with my hands in my lap. The exhibit case, I noticed, had not been damaged. The gap in the base seal was still there, was perhaps slightly larger, and the discoloration along the inside of the glass had changed. It was more pronounced now, a deeper amber gold in some areas, as though whatever the stone had been generating had reacted with the residue that the conservators had never identified. I made a mental note to document this. It was a reflex, the professional reflex of a person who catalogs environmental changes in controlled spaces, and I did not suppress it. I wanted that reflex. I wanted all my reflexes intact, because I had just been given something that was going to ask everything of me eventually, and I thought it was important not to dissolve into it all at once. I stood up slowly, joints complaining, and I picked up the chamois cloth from where it had fallen and the spray bottle, and I looked at the smear on the lower left corner of the glass. I cleaned it. I want you to understand that I cleaned it. I stood up in a room where a stone pillar had just been cold and dark for 1,000 years and had spoken 5 words to me and told me in 1 second the architecture of 2 ancient civilizations and my bloodline's role in the covenant between them, and I cleaned the smear off the glass. It took about 40 seconds. I did a good job of it. I do not report this as a joke or as a signal of admirable composure. I report it because it is what happened, and because I think it is the most honest description I can give of the state I was in, capable of attending to what was in front of me, because attending to what is in front of you is not a small thing, and I had just been reminded in the most definitive possible way that the people who do that quietly, reliably, without recognition, are exactly the people the most ancient things in existence were calibrated to trust. I put the chamois cloth and the spray bottle in my maintenance cart, and I sat in the chair by the gallery door, the small folding chair I had put there years ago for the moments when I needed to check the climate readout on the wall. And I sat in that chair, and I thought about what I was going to do. The framework I had been given was enormous, and I will try to describe some of its contents, though I want to be clear that I am doing so incompletely. I have since spoken with people, specialists, some of them very credentialed, some of them with no credentials at all but with very clear eyes, who believe they understand what the steel communicated. They do not. What they have assembled is a version of it constructed from what I have been able to put into words, and words are a very small container for this particular thing. But I will try. The first accord was not a treaty. A treaty resolves a conflict by establishing terms. The accord was something prior to terms, a structure for the possibility of terms. It was an agreement that meaning could, in principle, be shared across the categorical gulf, and it required a carrier to function. Without the carrier, the accord was a locked system. With the carrier present and active and willing to perform the function, the accord could operate. The carrier's role was not interpreter. It was more fundamental than that. The carrier was the medium through which the two frameworks could generate overlap, the shared cognitive space in which meaning from one side could be apprehended by the other side, not translated but genuinely apprehended, a mind that comprehended both without being of either. The accord had been dormant for a very long time, not because the civilizations had resolved their issues or ceased to exist, but because no carrier had been present and active. The stele had been waiting for a carrier to make contact. It had been placed in a location where the carrier's lineage was concentrated, where the long chain of people carrying the right frequency had settled, generation by generation, for reasons that were not random but that would look random from any non-technical vantage point. What would happen now was not something the framework specified in detail. The framework told me what I was. It did not tell me what to do. That apparently was not something the architects of the accord had been able to specify in advance, because the carrier had to act from its own nature, not from instructions. Instructions would corrupt the neutrality that made the carrier useful in the first place. I had been designated. I had not been instructed. I sat in the folding chair, and I thought about this for a long time. What I came to, and what I still believe, is that the designation was not a burden handed to me without my consent, or that if it was the same kind of burden that a person inherits when they are born into a specific body with specific capacities. I did not ask to carry the frequency. I did not ask to be the current terminus of a very long biological line. I did not ask to be in the vault gallery on a Friday evening in late October with a chamois cloth and a spray bottle. But I was all of these things, and the question of whether I had chosen them seemed less important than the question of what I was going to do now that I knew what they meant. I thought about Dr. Haynes and his note about the smear. I thought about the facility's supervisor position and the informal shortlist I was not on. I thought about the 14 years I had spent in this building, and the 6 exhibits in this vault gallery, and the 63 years the stele had been at the university, and the much longer time it had been in the world. And I thought about my grandmother cleaning floors in a municipal building for 40 years and being remembered by almost nobody. And I thought, we kept our frequency because we had no reason to give it up. That is not a small thing. That is not a consolation. That is the actual mechanism of what happened. The ancient architects of the first accord needed a species that would maintain its native frequency across time, and the way a frequency is maintained is by not being repeatedly modified by systems of reward and recognition that require you to perform a different kind of mind. We were not unrewarded because we were unimportant. We were unrewarded because the systems of reward in every institution and society I have ever encountered are tuned to a different frequency, and to be unrewarded by them was, functionally, to be protected from them. I want to be careful here because I do not want this to sound like self-consolation, like the kind of story a person constructs to make their situation bearable. It is possible that is what it is. I have no way to prove otherwise. All I can tell you is that the framework I received in that second was not constructed with my feelings in mind. It was the operating manual of a very old machine, and the operating manual said, quite clearly, that the machine had been designed to be activated by a person who had not been continuously modified by institutional recognition, not a failed person, not a suffering person, a person who had been left, functionally, to remain what they were. I was left, functionally, to remain what I was. That is the truest description of my 14 years at the university that I have ever found. I got up from the folding chair at some point after 11 o'clock. The vault gallery was still faintly lit by the inscription on the stele, that pale violet white that made the room look like the inside of something that had decided to remember itself. I did not turn on the overhead lights. I stood in front of the stone for another minute and I looked at the spiral of glyphs, lit now from within, slow and deliberate in their ascent, and I said something aloud. I say this carefully. I do not know why I said it, and I will not claim that it was a response to anything I heard or felt. It was a response to the weight of what had been given, and to the understanding that designation without acknowledgement is not designation at all. It requires the carrier to receive it consciously, to stand in front of what has recognized you and say, plainly, yes. I said I heard you. That was all, 2 words. But they were the right 2, because after them the room was different in the way a room is different after the door is properly closed, not quieter, not darker, just settled. Finished. The framework in my bones that had unfurled was now stable, not expanding, not contracting. It was simply there, the way a structure is there once it is built, load-bearing, reliable, present. I collected my cart, and I went to sign out at the facilities desk in the main building, and the security guard at the desk looked up at me and said it was a cold one outside, and I said yes, and he said have a good weekend, and I said you too. And I walked out of the building into the late October air, which was cold and smelled of rain and leaves, and I walked to the bus stop and waited in the shelter. And when the bus came I got on and paid my fare and found a seat and rode home. The following Monday I came in to work as usual. I did my rounds. I checked the climate readout in the vault gallery and noted that the temperature was stable and that the discoloration on the inside of the glass on Exhibit 14 had not changed further. I noted in the maintenance log that the base seal on Case 14 required repair and that access to the exhibit was compromised by the gap. I did not note what had passed through the gap on Friday evening. I noted the smear had been resolved. I want to be clear that I did not do this because I was afraid of what would happen if I reported it. I did not do it because I believed I would not be believed, although I did believe that, and I was right, as subsequent events confirmed. I did it because I needed time to understand what being the carrier meant in practice, and reporting it immediately would have transferred control of that process to people whose institutions were, by definition, the wrong kind of structure for this. The university's response would have been conservation, documentation, committee review, sequencing of the inscription by 3 departments, a journal paper, a press release, the arrival of many people with lanyards. None of that was wrong. Much of it was inevitable, but it needed to wait until I had some understanding of what I was actually carrying, so that when the people with lanyards arrived, and they were always going to arrive, I would not be managed by them. I would be working with them, from a position of prior knowledge. I went home in the evenings and I read. I had always read widely, without an obvious system, in the way that people read who have spent a lot of time alone and have made their own education out of what was available. History, biology, linguistics, philosophy of mind, cosmology when it was written for non-specialists, and a great deal of archaeology, because I work in a building full of old things and you develop a certain orientation over time. I had also read, without ever quite knowing why, extensively in the study of intermediary roles in ancient societies, the people who existed at the threshold between the community and whatever the community understood to be larger than itself. The temple sweepers, the threshold keepers, the people whose job was to be present in the liminal space between the known and the not known, and to maintain that space rather than to cross it. I had read about them the way you read about something that you cannot name your interest in. That does not seem professionally relevant, that you have simply been drawn to return to again and again over years without understanding the draw. I understood the draw now. The reading I did in those weeks was different from any reading I had done before. I was not acquiring information. I was calibrating the framework against what I already knew, testing the architecture against the world I had spent 47 years inhabiting, looking for the joints where the two connected. And what I found was that the joints were everywhere, and that what had looked like a scattered and unsystematic reading life was not scattered at all. I had been building, without knowing it, exactly the reference library that this moment needed. The framework I had received from the steel was the spine, and the reading was the flesh, and the two fitted together with a precision that would have felt uncanny if I had not already received the explanation for it. They connected in many places, more places than I expected. The history of interspecies communication is very short. We barely have a concept of it, even now, but the history of humans who existed at the margin of their own societies, who were not owned by the institutional frameworks of their time, is very long. And if you look at that history through the lens of the framework I had been given, you start to see things that are not coincidences but were never named as what they were. The custodians, the intermediaries, the people who swept the temple floor, and who were, for that reason, permitted to be present when the temple was doing what temples are actually for. I read for 3 weeks before I told anyone. The person I told first was not a specialist. She was a woman named Brecca Halst who ran the small archival conservation unit on the building's 4th floor, and who had, on approximately 40 separate occasions over 14 years, stopped me in a corridor or at a shared coffee station to ask whether I had noticed something strange about Exhibit 14 in the vault gallery. Specifically, whether I had noticed that the discoloration on the inside of the glass appeared to respond to changes in the humidity level even when the humidity level did not change. Brecca had been trying to have this investigated for 11 years and had been told by 3 successive conservation directors that it was an artifact of the ventilation issue and would be resolved when the capital expenditure was finally approved. I told Brecca on a Tuesday in November. I told her everything, in the even tone I had been practicing, from the chamois cloth to the smear to the gap in the base seal to the warmth of the stone and the sound that moved through my sternum and the pale violet-white light and the 5 words and the second of arriving whole comprehension and what I had been sitting with in the 3 weeks since. Brecca listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a while. Then she said, "I knew the humidity response wasn't the ventilation." I said it wasn't. She said, "What do you need?" I said, "I need someone who can help me document what happened without the documentation being the point. I need someone who understands that the stele doesn't need to be proven. It needs to be understood." Brecca said, "I can do that." And she did. Over the following 6 months, Brecca and I built a documentation of the stele and of what had happened that was careful and precise and grounded, and entirely unlike the documentation that would have been produced by the university's official channels. We did not focus on the inscription. We could not read it, and the interpretation of it was something that I understood was going to take much longer than 6 months, and required a different kind of mind than either of ours, and possibly required the kinds of minds that had not yet been born. We focused on the physical record, the change in the discoloration, the change in the ambient temperature inside the case, the acoustic resonance readings that Brecca had been taking informally for years with a small handheld device she had bought with her own money, which showed that the stele's subacoustic output had changed measurably in the weeks after the contact. We focused on me, not in a psychological way, not in a way that invited the narrative of delusion or episode. We documented the framework systematically, treating it as the kind of knowledge that arrives through a channel that is not language and can only be expressed in language imperfectly. We built a vocabulary for it together, Brecca asking questions and me trying to answer them with the precision they deserved, both of us understanding that the vocabulary was going to be inadequate, and that an inadequate vocabulary is still better than silence. By spring, we had 200 pages of careful, honest, grounded documentation. Brecca formatted it and I read every word of it, and we spent a month checking it against each other's understanding, removing anything that felt performed or inflated, keeping only what we were certain of. We sent copies to 6 people, not institutions, people, 2 archaeolinguists, 1 at a university on another continent and 1 who had retired and was working independently, a physicist who had published on resonance phenomena in geological materials, a philosopher of mind who had written a short, little-read book about the conditions under which a species might be capable of genuine interframework comprehension, rather than surface-level translation. An historian who had spent her career studying the custodial and intermediary roles in ancient ceremonial contexts. And a neurobiologist who had done her doctoral work on the question of whether certain cognitive architectures might be heritable in ways that were more specific and functional than general intelligence. We did not tell any of them what to expect. We sent the documentation and said, "Here is a record of something that happened. We are trying to understand it. We would welcome your thinking." 5 of the 6 responded. 3 of them came to the university. 2 of those 3 had, separately, been working on adjacent questions for years without knowing there were others doing the same. And the conversation they had in the small conference room on the 4th floor, with Brecka and me, and the physicist and the philosopher of mind, over 2 days in late April, with the vault gallery 1 floor below us, and the stele lit softly in its case, was the closest thing I have experienced to what the first accord must have felt like in its earliest stages. People with radically different categorical frameworks trying, carefully, to find the points of genuine overlap. At one point, the archaeolinguist from the other continent looked at me across the table and said, "You understand that you are describing a mechanism, not a mystical experience, a mechanism that was designed." I said, "Yes." He said, "And you understand that if you are right, then the question is not what happened to you, but what you are supposed to do with it." I said, "I have been trying to determine that." He said, "How?" I said, "By paying attention to what I already know how to do and doing it." He said, "That is either the most profound answer or the most frustrating one." I said, "I think it is both. I think that is probably also true of the accord itself." He was quiet for a moment, and then the philosopher of mind, who had not spoken for an hour, looked up from her notes and said, "The mechanism requires the carrier to remain undistorted by the process of carrying it, which means the moment the carrier starts to perform the role rather than simply be the role, the frequency changes." I said, "Yes." She said, "That is an extraordinary constraint to place on a living person." I said, "It is the only constraint that makes the system work. I have been thinking about it as a discipline rather than a burden. You cannot perform neutrality. You can only maintain it." She wrote something in her notes. The physicist had been listening with his eyes closed, which was his habit, and he opened them and said that the subacoustic output data Brecka had collected showed a consistent pattern in its variation that was not random, that it appeared to be responsive to changes in the carrier's proximity to the stele on any given day, and that if the output was a signal, the pattern suggested the signal was doing something he could only describe, inadequately, as listening back. I looked at Brecka, Brecka looked at me. We had suspected this for a while but had not said it aloud to each other, and I was glad that it had come from the physicist rather than from us, because it was the kind of observation that needed to come from outside the relationship between the carrier and the stone to have any credibility in the room. He looked at me across the table and said, "That is either the most profound answer or the most frustrating one." I said, "I think it is both. I think that is probably also true of the accord itself." He looked at me for a moment, and then he wrote something in his notebook, and I did not ask what it was, and he did not tell me. The people with lanyards came, eventually. They were not avoidable, and I had not tried to avoid them. By the time they arrived, I had 11 months of preparation behind me, and I sat in their interviews and told them what I have told you in the same even tone, and answered their questions precisely, and declined to help them with the things they were trying to do that were not what I thought the stele needed. The university wanted to move the exhibit. I said no. They had no legal mechanism to override my refusal, which was the position Brecka and I had determined in advance, because I was the designated carrier, and the stele had not given any indication of being transferable, and the gap in the base seal meant that the exhibit was technically in a condition that required maintenance access, and the maintenance access was mine. They brought in a specialist conservator who tried to close the gap in the base seal. The gap remained open. She documented this carefully and submitted a report that used the phrase anomalous material resistance 4 times. I appreciated her precision. I want to tell you about one specific evening, because it is the part of this that I keep returning to when I am trying to understand what I am now. It was in July, 8 months after the first contact. It was a Sunday, and the building was empty, and I had come in not as part of my duties, but because I had wanted to be in the vault gallery, which had started to feel like a part of my professional space that I had been using for years without knowing what it was. The way you walk into a room in a house you have lived in for a long time, and suddenly understand the room's actual shape for the first time. I was sitting in the folding chair by the door. The steel was lit with its permanent soft inscription glow. It had not gone fully dark since the first contact, which was one of the measurable changes Brecca and I had documented, and I was not doing anything in particular. Not reading, not thinking with deliberate intent, not preparing anything. I was just being in the room with the stone. And the stone did something that it had not done before, not a transmission, not a voice. Something smaller, the glow along the lowest few rows of the inscription, the first characters of the spiral, the beginning of whatever the text said, intensified briefly. Just the lowest register, just those first few lines, brightening for about 10 seconds and then returning to steady. I knew what it meant. I knew in the same way I had known everything since November, not inference, not interpretation, but the direct apprehension that the framework makes possible when you have been living with it long enough. It was acknowledgement, not recognition, that had already happened. That was the night of the first contact, the designation spoken. Acknowledgement is something different. Acknowledgement is the response to what you do after you receive the designation. It is the confirmation that you have been carrying it correctly, that the frequency has been maintained, that the work you have been doing in the months since, the careful documentation, the 200 pages, the conference room conversations, the boundary setting with the people with lanyards, the Sunday evenings in the folding chair, is the work the carrier is supposed to do. I sat with that for a while in the quiet building. What I was supposed to do, I understood, was not spectacular. It was not going to change the world in a weekend, and I had always known that, but it was important to sit with the confirmation. The work of a carrier is slow, careful, precise work. It is the work of maintaining the structure that makes eventual communication possible, not of producing the communication itself. The communication will happen, is happening, in increments so small that they are measurable only in the aggregate, in the changes in the documentation and the thinking of the people who are now paying attention. But the carrier does not perform it. The carrier is the medium through which it can happen, and the medium's job is to remain available, accurate, and present. This is not a humble position. I have heard it described as a humble position by people trying to be kind to me, and I understand why they reach for that word, but it is not accurate. Being the medium for the most ancient attempt at interspecies comprehension that has ever been documented is not a humble thing. It is an enormous thing. What makes it look humble from the outside is that it does not come with a title, or a ceremony, or an institutional framework, or anything that the systems of recognition most people operate inside are equipped to register. The systems of recognition do not register it, the steel does. I got up from the folding chair, and I stood in front of the stone, and I looked at the inscription for a while in the soft light. The lowest rows had returned to their usual glow. The whole spiral was steady and present. The top face was sealed and would remain sealed until whatever the next stage of the process was, and I did not know when that would be or what it would require or how long it would take. I knew that I would be there when it happened, not because I had determined to be, though I had, but because the frequency I carry does not need to be maintained by determination. It is what I am. It is what the long chain of people before me were. It is what the very old architects of the first accord had been patient enough and far-sighted enough to need, and to wait for, and to build a stone instrument to find. I picked up the folding chair and folded it and leaned it against the wall and checked the climate readout, and entered the numbers in the maintenance log, and made sure the vault gallery door was properly sealed when I left. Outside, the July air was warm. The campus was empty and the lights in the old buildings were off, and the trees along the central path held their summer weight, and I walked to the bus stop and the bus came and I rode home. I have been the carrier now for 8 months, and I will be the carrier for as long as I am alive, and after me there will be another, and the steel will wait in exactly the same way it has always waited, without any experience of duration, without impatience, without doubt. The doubt, if there is any, is mine. And the honest answer is that there is less of it than there used to be. The ancient thing knew what it was looking for, and it found it in the right person, which was not a remarkable person, but was the correct one, which is a distinction I have spent my whole life learning to understand, and which I will spend the rest of it learning to live up to. That is enough. That has always been enough. The stone told me so, and I believed it, and I believe it still.